Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the philosophy known as physicalism, sometimes known as materialism. With me is Dr. Paul Smith, who received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin. Paul is currently the president of the International Remote Viewing Association. He is the author of the Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, as well as Reading the Enemy's Mind. In addition, he has prepared DVD instructional sets for both dowsing and remote viewing. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
You know, it's been a controversy for a long time, the philosophy of physicalism or materialism, and the idea that the findings of parapsychology seem to contradict that philosophical worldview, which is very unfortunate for parapsychology, remote viewing, and dowsing, since these are the dominant philosophical modes in Western civilization today.
That's correct. And as you know, if you ever go against your boss, that you lose, right?
Yeah.
Well, you can think of physicalism as the boss in science and psychology today.
It's not only the dominant mode, it's what you might call a paradigm, which means, according to Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the famous book on scientific paradigms, that it's unconscious. People accept, especially in academia, people accept physicalism without even thinking about it.
You can think of, in philosophical terms, you can think of a paradigm as a metaphysical system in which you understand everything. That's the thing that how you understand the universe. And someone who's a religious believer would have a religious paradigm, if you will, and so they interpret everything in terms of what they believe and accept in that. So physicalism, and you've used materialism and physicalism, and materialism is kind of going out because what happens in materialism, the premise is that everything that isn't material in some way is non-existent, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, that also throws out things like mathematics, because mathematics in and of itself, although it can be used to describe physical systems, the mathematical systems themselves are not physical. They aren't material, and so materialism throws out too much. Yeah. So they've come up with this idea of physicalism, and the simple way to describe physicalism is, physicalism is the doctrine that everything in the universe is physical, or it is the consequence of physical facts. And so then you can have mathematics still be accepted in the fold, and other things that are not physical but are a result of physical properties or physical relationships.
Well, explain to me how mathematics fits into physicalism.
Well, a physicalist might argue that mathematical relationships are just a consequence of the way physical properties and physical substances interact or relate to each other. And mathematics is just a natural of course, it's an artificial language that we've created to describe these natural relationships.
Because Plato had another view. Plato and people who were Platonists believed that the realm of pure mathematics is eternal and non-physical.
And it was the physical domain that was the redheaded stepchild, if you will, right? And to them, they privileged the realm of the forms. The forms were non-physical,
pure geometric forms.
Yes, and the matter, things made out of matter, were kind of degenerate and secondary, and were not permanent.
Well, that philosophy is out of favor today.
It is. Well,
except amongst mathematicians.
Yes, that's true, and people who are what is known as idealists, who believe that the physical world is an illusion, right? But science and psychology, it's the dominant version. It's the paradigm, as you say.
For example, with regard to consciousness, a physicalist would say that human consciousness is the product of neuron activity in our brains.
Or some kind of brain activity. As we learn more about the brain, we realize there's much more going on in the brain than just neuron firings. And so they're expanding their notion of the physical interactions of the brain that give rise to consciousness. The interesting thing is they still don't know how that works. It's kind of an article of faith that the mind just is brain functioning, right? But they've not been able to actually prove that in any scientific way.
In fact, philosophers say they can't prove it. There's no way that you can get from inert matter to consciousness.
This is called the hard problem. David Chalmers was one of the proponents of that term. And so the hard problem is determining how matter and the way matter interacts and physical properties and how physical properties interact, how they can give rise to this experience we have of consciousness, how we can, the feel of cool air on your face, or the color of grass, or the sounds of a violin, the experience of that, no one has figured out how you can have that based on something that's made out of rock or silica or whatever, right?
And philosophers call those experiences qualia.
Yes, and it stands for qualitative experiences as opposed to quantitative, which is, of course, quantitative analysis and such is the darling of science, because it's objective in some interesting way. So the problem with physicalism, of course, is that if they're correct about the world being only physical or the consequence of physical facts, then you lose things like free will, you lose things like God existing or the spirit existing or whatever. A lot of these sort of metaphysical beliefs
and
that people have for a long
exalted
time.
human emotions like love get reduced down to something like the need to reproduce the species.
Chemical interactions, whatever, right? So physicalism is right, then those things are wrong. That they're just illusions. And of course, if physicalism is right, we have to accept that fact.
Well, I think it's fair to say, Paul, that even though most academics, especially scientists, are physicalists, most people
are not.
Most people are probably, they don't think about it, but if you were to pin them down, most people are probably dualists.
Yes, and which we will need to get into here as we go. But if physicalism is true, we have to accept the consequences. There's no free will, there's no God, there's none of that stuff, right? Which is legitimate if we can establish that physicalism really is true. But it turns out that this belief in physicalism, there's some smoke and mirrors going on. It's basically a con job in a way.
According to you.
According to me. And in fact, if you look at how they've arrived at this, you know it's a con job.
And not just you. There are many,
Yes, there are others who would agree with me. Yes, they might not speak that strongly about it. But I also want to say that it's not an evil or an intentional con job. The people who advocate physicalism absolutely believe it's true. Absolutely believe it's true. It's just like someone else who has a religion that they absolutely believe is true. And in certain ways, physicalism is very much like a religion because it's based on faith, elements of faith. You have to take some things as assumed that you don't have evidence for, those kind of things.
Well, you know, when I was a graduate student, my dissertation advisor, a well-known philosopher of science, Michael Scriven, and we would debate this occasionally, and he said, you've got to understand materialism, which is what he called it back in those days.
That was the term for it back then,
He said, it's like imperialism. Whatever new findings you come up with that seem to contradict will eventually become incorporated within the empire of materialism. So materialism may modify itself, but if let's say remote viewing becomes accepted across the board as a scientific phenomenon, well, whatever we have to do to modify materialism or physicalism, we will do to incorporate that data.
And we've seen that happen in the past a lot. Magnetism at one time was believed to be supernatural, and ultimately we came up with a theory that explained it in physical terms. Lots of things have happened that way. The way science works is, at least modern science works, is that you don't get incorporated in the physicalist paradigm until you have an explanation, right? And so for things like remote viewing, consciousness, we don't have an explanation, and so it's kind of held out there, and And
these phenomena, and even though they're extremely well documented,
Yes.
remote viewing, it's still on the fringes.
evidence is not enough for acceptance.
And consciousness, well, surely every human being has the direct experience of consciousness, and yet up until maybe a decade or 2 or 3 ago, it was considered only the province of religion, not science at all.
Well, I gave a talk on consciousness in ESP one time, and I said consciousness is an interesting thing. On the one hand, nobody knows what it is, but on the other hand, everybody knows what it is, because we all have the subjective experience of consciousness. Now, the interesting thing is there are philosophers and psychologists who deny the fact that consciousness exists.
Yeah.
They're called eliminativists, and they say that consciousness is just an illusion. Of course, the problem with that is they're not explaining what it is, what the illusion is an illusion to. You have to have a perceiver to perceive an illusion. So that's pretty much a minority view in the world. But the general belief is that consciousness is, in fact, a property of physical, of the physical. The interesting thing, though, is that it's an assumption. It's based on this thing. The primary assumption behind physicalism is called the causal closure. The causal closure premise is how I'll call it that, right? What that says is that no cause can come from the outside of the physical universe into the universe and have an effect. And no cause can go from inside the physical universe to the outside of it and come back in and have an effect. And the general assumption is that's because there's nothing outside the physical universe. And so you can't have any of these things occur. Everything has to be explainable in physical terms.
Or I think as Descartes was confronted with a conundrum, he was a dualist, but even so, if you have consciousness and it has no extension, it's completely non-physical, then how can it interact with the physical world in any case?
And to me, that's a that question about interactionism, I think, begs some questions. Because, well, we're sort of going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but that's okay. Interactionism assumes that a non-physical thing cannot have an effect on a physical thing and vice versa. But we don't know that. There may be bridge laws, there may be bridge properties that allow that to happen, assuming there is non-physical and physical. There are plenty of domains within the physical universe where you have two forces or two substances that can't interact in their own nature, but there are bridging properties or bridging principles that allow them to interact under certain circumstances. So metaphorically, it would seem that it's maybe a little too early to rule out the fact that if there is something non-physical, it can't interact in the
I know
physical
John
world.
Searle, who was a very prominent philosopher of mind I've interviewed and knew when I was a Berkeley student, used to say that consciousness is to the brain as digestion is to the stomach.
Yes.
Which is a kind of physicalistic reduction.
It is. And I think that to some degree it's probably right, and to some degree it's probably wrong. I mean, we assume that consciousness is all of one thing. But it's quite possible that there are physical properties of consciousness, but there are other elements of consciousness that are non-physical. Okay? And you would therefore see some physical elements to consciousness when you examine them from a physical perspective, but it doesn't rule out everything else. Now, here's the thing, right? The only you have to assume the physical story because the evidence they keep bringing in suggests physicalism is true, unless you have evidence that points the other direction, that physicalism isn't true, or points to isn't true in the terms of a general statement. Physicalism is true of physical properties, is of the physical universe. But, and here's an interesting point I often make, so like consciousness, they'll say, well, consciousness can't exist because if it is the way you define it, then it violates the laws of physics. Well, what if it's something that is of equal reality to physics, but not in the physical domain? It doesn't violate any physical laws then, right? If
it's non-physical.
If it's non-physical, it doesn't violate any physical laws. It just doesn't behave the way physics does. And so that argument about violating physical laws is probably, again, a red herring argument, right? So
Oh, okay, but now you're beginning to talk about the data of remote viewing
Yes.
and parapsychology.
So what you need to do, because essentially physicalism is based on what science is based on, is inductive evidence and inference to the best explanation. Now, I know some people's eyeballs just roll back in their heads when I use those terms, but let me explain induction very quickly. Induction, all that means is that you find a whole bunch of instances of something and you can infer from there that everything like that will be like that. So swans are a good example, right? So also this swan is white, this swan is white, that swan is white, and you conclude because that's the only ever you found is white swans that all swans are white. And that's how science does things. When you set up this experiment this way, it happens this way. You set up again this way, you set up again this way, you add these variables, it still happens this way. Okay, then you can assume that principle that you're exploring, it holds in all cases.
It holds until you find a black swan.
That's the problem, because it's not a logical argument, it's an inductive argument, which means essentially only those members of that set that are that way are that way. So what happened with swans, and this is, we talk about white crows, but this is works really well with swans, because all swans are white until they found a population of black swans in Australia that can interbreed, which is the definition of species, right? Can interbreed with the white swans. So it turned out that not all swans were white.
And you only need one counterexample to disprove an inductive conclusion.
Logically, you only need one. Psychologically, you need a whole bunch. Right? Because,
People will say, I don't believe it.
One, I don't know.
That was just lucky.
What if I have 5,000? Well, then I got to rethink that, right? So we actually have that condition. So what you want to do to throw a question mark on physicalism is find evidence that does seem to essentially reject this causal closure hypothesis.
Well, we have 150 years of empirical investigations into psychical research and parapsychology.
You are reading my mind. That's exactly where I'm going.
I say it all the time to people, and I'm amazed because many people are in absolute denial, and other people, of course, are ignorant. They're entitled to be ignorant. There's no fault in being ignorant, but the deniers really bother me.
The people who are keeping them ignorant, there is fault with them, because there is a studied campaign to keep that information from being available to the public in general. Now, not to the point where it's criminal activity, but there's almost a conspiracy to keep that from coming out.
It's like it's a taboo topic, so that if you should bring it up, the deniers have all sorts of reasons why it doesn't count, even though we're talking about a library full of information.
And of course this is a topic that we could spend hours on.
We could.
But the problem, of course, this goes back to the paradigms. Because if you have a paradigm, it's a very integral part of yourself. The paradigm you belong to, everybody has a paradigm of some kind. The paradigm you belong to that's very personal to you. It doesn't matter if it's a religious paradigm or if it's a scientific paradigm. Scientists who are physicalists cherish this idea of physicalism. And so if you bring up something that conflicts with it, there's this massive case of cognitive dissonance that starts up. And either they've got to change their paradigm, which is massively hard for anybody to do, or they have to find some way of rejecting the evidence that conflicts with what they believe. And so as far as right now, that's what they're doing, is rejecting the evidence, even though it's there.
And often it's done loudly and rudely.
Yes, and that's usually the case with any kind of paradigm. People like to make fun of religious folks, because when their beliefs are challenged, they get all upset and offended. Happens no matter what your paradigm is. You find that especially in physicalists. So what the ESP evidence is argument for is actually, the reason it undermines physicalism is because it destroys this causal closure argument. Because essentially physicalism demonstrates one of two things. Either a cause coming from outside and into the physical universe and affecting something. That's less powerful, because a cause like that you really can't see where it came from. What the ESP evidence is valuable for is it shows one of these causal chains that we know where it starts within the physical universe. We know where it ends within the physical universe, But the whole middle part is missing. We don't know how it gets from here to here, which strongly suggests it's getting outside of the physical universe and coming in elsewhere.
Or another hypothesis is that we don't really understand the nature of time and space itself. That we have certain assumptions we make about time and space and matter and energy, and maybe we'll have to change those assumptions. Maybe it's just space.
Science will grow to accept it, which is one of the things you suggested when we first started out. So I'm going to skip several hours worth of argument here and say that yes, you cannot rule out the possibility that science can expand its horizons and encompass all of this material as well. But right now, if you were betting on it, the probability is very slim that science will be able to do that. And one of the reasons is because of the nature of the knowledge that we'd have to acquire and how we'd have to acquire it. It would be our instrumentation may not be sufficient, may not ever get to the point where it can. The other problem is that, back in the turn of the 19th century, there were folks who said, well, we've learned everything there is to know in science. Science won't progress any further. Of course, we have 116 years to prove that totally false, right? But we heard it again recently. There are people saying, well, we're pretty close. In fact, I'm blanking on his first name, but Weinberg, physicist at the University of Texas, famous Nobel Prize winner, very respected physicist. He's essentially said that in some of his books.
We're very close to the theory of everything.
Yes, we're very close to that. There's not much more. Obviously, we'll learn details and things, but any breakthroughs, which this would require, this what we're talking about would require is a massive breakthrough. Most of that stuff, we're not going to have them anymore, right? There's still that feeling and belief. There's more reason to believe that today than there was in 1899. Much more reason to believe that today than 1899. And if you do look at what we know in science, no, we can't discount the possibility of some massive breakthrough, but the odds of it are pretty low.
Especially when you begin to incorporate some of the more unusual kinds of data that come up in the field of parapsychology relating, for example, to reincarnation and survival after death. That would throw a real monkey wrench into the potential for any kind of conventional explanation from 21st century science.
Yeah, I have to be intellectually honest and say it's possible physics will figure all this out. But I have to say, not just my gut feeling, but my analysis of the state of knowledge today says that it's probably not going to.
Well, suppose, Paul, that somebody is able to watch our video interaction 1,000 years from now, or even 1,000,000.
And in between the bursts of laughter, right?
No, I think it's a very realistic to think that this very discussion will be preserved electronically. It could last 1,000,000 years.
And the problem still could be the opponents could still be opponents in 1,000 years. It's quite possible that it won't be resolved in that amount of time, short of like the second coming. Now that would solve the problem, wouldn't it? But yeah, so it's an interesting argument, and the one side I don't think is playing fairly, frankly. And it's because of the psychology requiring to preserve the paradigm at all costs that they're trying to defend.
If we do away with physicalism, does that mean we have to acknowledge that science itself will never have a handle on these problems?
Well, it may, but what's wrong with that? And one of the arguments is, well, this can't be true because then that would mean science will never be complete. Well, that's baloney. Science can be complete in its domain. It just would have to allow that there is this other domain that it doesn't have a handle on. It also doesn't mean that science can never know anything about the domain, because we learn things about domains we cannot physically explore all the time. Nuclear particle physics is based largely on indirect observations of conditions we set in environments that we cannot penetrate, right? And so we already know a lot about consciousness and ESP based on physical observations we make about these occurrences. So there's no reason to say science can't learn about it. It may not be able to learn everything about it, but it can certainly learn a lot about it if we adopt honest, well-resourced, carefully done experimentation and exploration. And of course, this paradigmatic war that we're having precludes a real solid research program into ESP and consciousness. If we could do away with that conflict and just take it as a scientific discipline to be pursued like any other one, I think we'd make massive headroads and we have a much better chance of understanding it.
Well, that's a very practical approach.
I think so.
I mean, let's find out, push the scientific method as far as we can, at the same time acknowledging that there may be certain problems that will forever remain beyond science.
And you know, that's fair enough. One of the problems with the arguments against ESP from the scientific community is that, well, we can't answer that question, so we shouldn't explore it. And the fact is, sometimes you don't get answers, and you should be okay with that. Doesn't mean you stop exploring or checking back every now and again, see if we learn something that'll work. But there's nothing wrong with recognizing, and in fact, there's a value to recognizing some domains that we just don't know what to do with.
What we're talking about here is empirical data, which surely does fall within the domain of science, but for which we seem to be unable to come up with a complete theory.
That's right. Yep.
And now logically, you also have Gödel's paradox, in which he...
And Gödel, by the way, was an idealist. He was not a physicalist. And he's the darling of the physicalists, but he rejected physicalism. So.
And his paradox is that no system of logic can ever explain itself.
That's right, yeah.
Which suggests that perhaps we cannot use human consciousness to ever fully explain human consciousness.
Yeah. A number of philosophers back then were talking about this idea of internal and external questions. Carnap was one of them, where you can, if you're inside a system, you explore the entire inside of it, but you can never know what it's like from the outside, right? And so we see that brought up a lot. So.
Well, now we're getting to the heart of some of the real paradoxes in the mind-body problem.
Yeah.
Well, Paul Smith, we're out of time. Once again, it goes quickly when you relish the discussion so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with me, Paul. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. You're totally welcome.
I hope to have you back again.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And thank you for being with us.